I made a video a while ago about action, and why some action scenes succeed and are really exciting, while others, despite being visually impressive, still wind up being boring. The main example that I used for that was a movie called Extraction, which, despite being a pretty typical, run-of-the-mill, shoot-first, make-sense-later action flick, still managed to include one of the best action sequences I've ever seen. It was so good that I made a whole video about why I thought it worked so well, and clearly I wasn't the only one who thought so. Extraction was such a big hit for Netflix that they greenlit a sequel to a movie that really didn't seem like it was meant to have one. I mean, the hero dies in the end, or at least he would've if logic was taken into account, but there was money to be made, so the hero was miraculously resurrected, and we got Extraction 2, The Extrusioning, and wow. Let's just say I don't think they'll be making a third. Unless it makes money, then they'll definitely be making a third. Yeah, they're making a third. God help us. Anyway, Extraction 2 is a bad movie, which by itself is hardly shocking. Again, it's a completely unnecessary sequel to a film that wasn't exactly Citizen Kane to begin with. What's interesting about the sequel isn't so much that it's terrible, but rather that it was made by the same people who made the original, including director Sam Hargrave and screenwriter Joe Russo. You'd think if anyone was capable of repeating the success of the first, it'd be the people responsible for the first, and it's pretty obvious that that's what they were trying to do. These movies are essentially the same. Hostages who need rescuing from an impossible situation? Check. The plan to do so falls apart soon after it begins? Check. This results in a metric butt-ton of brutally violent action that goes on for way longer than a typical action scene lasts, and a large portion of that is shot in one single take? Check, check, and check. And yet, despite the filmmaker's best efforts to copy and paste, the end result was still a complete and utter faceplant. The question is, why? As I said in the first video, the stuff they can do these days with stunts, special effects, CGI, cinematography, and whatever else is nothing short of incredible. We should be in awe, but we often aren't. I sure wasn't with this movie, and since the problem wasn't technical, that means it had to be narrative. So let's go over these two sequences to see if we can figure out what went wrong. The first sequence is where Tyler Rake and his team of mercenaries attempt to rescue Ovi, who's being held hostage by this gang in Bangladesh. After Tyler meets with the kidnappers to learn Ovi's location, he leaves under the pretense of getting their ransom money. Then, with the help of this sniper played by director Sam Hargrave, he takes out his escort, goes full Rambo on this room full of goons, gets Ovi, drives him to the woods, and off they head for this boat, but before they can get there, Tyler's team is ambushed, leaving him and Ovi stranded. So he gets Ovi back to the car and they try to escape that way, but the police cut them off and chase them into an apartment complex that is soon teeming with bad guys, including Saju, who's trying to get Ovi for his own reasons, and who's been built up as Tyler's equal. After lots of sneaking around and close quarters combat, these two finally meet and have this insane gunfight, knife fight, fist fight that ends with them both getting hit by cars. Fortunately, Tyler is driving the second one, which leads to a second car chase before he and Ovi jump out and use the resulting explosion as cover to get away. I hadn't actually watched this since I made the first video a few years ago, so I didn't know if it would hold up. It does. This sequence is an action masterpiece, and my hat's off to everyone involved. And that brings us to Extrusion, which starts where Extraction ends, which is right after Tyler gets shot like 50 times, once through his throat, then falls unconscious into a river and sinks. This actually reminded me a little of the show Sherlock, when he seemed to die at the end of Season 1 by throwing himself off a building only to miraculously come back at the start of Season 2, where it's revealed he planned this whole elaborate illusion. I actually thought they handled this really well, and I was hoping that Extrusion wasn't necessarily going to do the same thing, but that they were going to make a similar effort to explain how Tyler could have survived the unsurvivable, and that they weren't just going to phone it in and have him wash up on shore and magically still be alive. So, guess what they did? Yup, washed up on shore, magically still alive. So after a long hospital stay, Tyler is sent to this log cabin to enjoy a peaceful, extraction-free retirement that lasts about 5 seconds before Idris Elba, of all people, shows up and says, "You need to extract someone, Tyler, and not just anyone, but your estranged wife's sister, who just so happens to be married to the criminal underlord of Georgia, the country." where he's in prison and his wife and children are in prison with him, and the wife doesn't want to be, so they need to be rescued. That's the premise. So we get this Rocky IV montage where Tyler gets back into shape, then he calls up Nick and Yaz from the first movie, and off they go. The plan, if you can call it that, which we only learn as it's being executed, is that the team will drive into the prison where these guards have been paid off to give Tyler a clear path to where the wife and kids are being held. Then all 4 of them will sneak out the same way and drive off with no one the wiser. So Tyler goes in and finds the right cell, then he signals to the wife that it's time to go, so she wakes her kids and gets them ready, which takes a while. The son, who worships his father, doesn't want to leave.
Keep quiet.
So the mother says they're going to meet him. Then as they're walking out, the daughter drops her teddy bear, which makes a noise that this prisoner hears, and he whistles, and that alerts the entire prison as to what's happening. So within 20 seconds of them leaving, their cover is blown, and Tyler has to start improvising. This bothers the wife and son.
Don't push me.
You're scaring him.
Yaz then directs them to a second extraction point.
Yep, ETA, 2 minutes.
Where they push the kids up this coal chute, but before Tyler and the wife can follow, the criminal ruler of Georgia shows up, and he and Tyler have this big fight that culminates with Tyler burning his face, ripping his hand open, and stabbing him in the neck before the wife hits him with the shovel just for good measure. Then they both stare at what they've done for a while before Nick interrupts them and says they should probably go, but before they can climb out, this crowd of prisoners is heading for them, so they have to run into the prison yard and fight their way through a full-blown riot before they make it to their cars and drive out the gate. A long car chase through the woods follows that involves cars, SUVs, a mini tank, and dirt bikes. Eventually they arrive wherever this is, and under heavy gunfire they board a train, which is immediately pursued by 2 helicopters. Tyler shoots one down, but the other gets these guys on board. There's more fighting, more killing, before Tyler shoots down the second helicopter and the train reaches the end of the tracks. But it can't stop because the brakes are shot, so it crashes. Fortunately, everyone is secured. Except for Tyler, who gets ragdolled. But he isn't hurt because. And that's the extraction sequence from Extrusion. It's bad. Through and through. It has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. The question again is why? Why is the sequel so much worse than the original when pretty much the same thing is happening in both? While there's plenty of small answers to that, I think there's one big one. So keep that in mind as I proceed to rip this thing to shreds. One thing that immediately struck me about the second sequence is they never go over the plan ahead of time. There's no chalk talk, as it's called. Chalk talks are useful in heist movies because they tell the audience what's supposed to happen, and then once our expectations have been established, they can later be subverted. But that doesn't happen here. We're just immediately tossed into this rescue where no one involved seems to have planned for anything other than the best case scenario, even though it only takes this girl dropping her teddy bear for everything to fall apart. And that happens almost immediately. If we go back to this first sequence, you see the rescue starts around here, when Tyler is contacted by the kidnappers. Things don't go wrong until here. That's 16 minutes of development, including this somewhat unrelated scene that introduces us to the main bad guy, all of which really pulls us into the story. But in the second sequence, which starts around here, things go wrong here, barely 3 minutes later, and nearly a minute of that is spent waiting for these damn kids to get ready. I know that sounds awful and it's not cool to blame the victims, but oh my god, this family is annoying. Ovi, by contrast, was not annoying. He behaved the way you'd think a kid in this situation would. He starts off pretty much in shock, then he tries to get away on his own, and even though he and Tyler have only just met and don't get along very well, they actually had great chemistry.
Kid, you trust me?
No.
So we weren't just rooting for Tyler here, but for Ovi as well. This family,
Don't push me.
You're scaring him.
not so much. Right out of the gate, I was irritated that we had to wait for them. Forcing characters to wait when they should be hurrying can be an effective way to build tension, but only if that delay is for a good reason, one that's beyond the character's control. This doesn't qualify. Neither does Yaz telling Tyler it's going to take 2 minutes for the team to get to the coal chutes. 2 minutes? You guys are in cars. How big is this prison? It's just way too clunky that Tyler has left the perfect amount of time for this dumb fight with the ruler of Georgia, which doesn't come close to matching Tyler's fight with Saju. Saju is huge. This guy isn't. We saw Saju in action before he and Tyler met, which built anticipation, whereas with this guy, we only learn about his rough upbringing. And as for the actual fight with Saju, it was just way better. It was more tense, more creative. They were falling off roofs and getting hit by cars. These two are just fighting in a basement.
You know, fighting in a basement offers a lot of difficulties. Number one being, you're fighting in a basement.
Then, after the husband is killed, once again, we are needlessly waiting while these two just stand there. They could have climbed up and down the coal chute 3 times by this point, and then we wouldn't have to suffer through the prison yard scene. While this is visually impressive, and I'm sure a ton of work went into shooting it in one single take, it goes on for so long that it just becomes redundant. Ditto that for the car chase. Not only does this go on for way too long, but unlike in the first sequence where they're trapped on these crowded streets that felt really claustrophobic, here they're out in the woods which go on forever. Speaking of things that go on forever, why would you get on a train here? Trains run on tracks, so the bad guys are gonna know where you're going. Worse than that, this train doesn't go anywhere. The track runs out after a few miles. So yeah, I think it's safe to say this sequence has a lot of problems. But again, those problems all have a common denominator. The question is, have you figured it out? If you have, well done, I always believed in you. If you haven't, then let's return one last time to the first sequence. A crucial aspect to this is that we never second guess anything Tyler does, especially after the plan falls apart. He's not some bonehead in a horror movie running upstairs when he could have just gone out the front door, because there is no front door. He and Ovi are stuck in a hopeless situation with no easy answers, and we are stuck with them. That's good storytelling. But in Extrusion, I second-guessed every decision the characters made because they kept making mistakes that we, the audience, wouldn't have. There's a term for that. It's called the idiot plot, which I've talked about before. And again, the idiot plot only works if you accept the characters in them would make the mistakes they do. Idiot plots will not work, however, if the characters in them are supposed to be experts, like these guys. They should know that you wouldn't just send Tyler into a prison looking like this. You'd send someone who looks like a guard. Someone who speaks Russian or Georgian or whatever, so that if they're seen, it's not immediately obvious what's happening. You also wouldn't have them all walk out together like this. You'd put the wife and kids in one of those big laundry carts, cover it, tell the children to shut the and then wheel them out. Do that, and this plan likely goes off without a hitch. And I understand that things have to go wrong to make this exciting, but again, the things that go wrong should not be the result of experts being idiots. That's bad storytelling, because it means all the bad things that happen will feel avoidable, like these 4 getting immediately spotted. Or the fight with the husband, which could have been avoided if this group of experts thought maybe they should have a backup plan. Or the prison yard fight, which could have been avoided if these two just left after the husband was killed. Or the train ride to nowhere, which could have been avoided if they didn't get on a train. That's the main reason this sequence didn't work. Experts can of course make mistakes, but they shouldn't have to make tons of really obvious ones just for a story to include lots of action. If that's the case, then your story probably needs a better premise, which is exactly what Extrusion needed. The whole notion of Tyler having to rescue his wife's sister from her evil Georgia-ruling husband, neither of whom's existence we were even aware of prior to this film, was never going to work because Tyler didn't even have to be involved. They could have got anyone to save her. Joe Russo, in his eagerness to turn Extraction into a franchise, somehow failed to understand that Tyler isn't James Bond. He's more like Jason Bourne. After the events of Extraction, you couldn't just give him a new random mission. Instead, you had to somehow personally drag him back into the fight. This didn't do that, but that doesn't mean there wasn't a solution. Believe it or not, a much better premise for this completely unnecessary sequel was right there for the taking. My final challenge for you is to name that premise. That might sound like a really tough question, but it actually isn't. All you have to do is ask yourself, who's the only person and an injured Tyler would immediately come out of retirement to rescue? The answer is obviously his wife. We know from the first movie these two have been separated since the death of their child, but imagine if after the traumatic events of Extraction, Tyler and his wife got back together and they went on to live a quiet, simple life until one day, the wife goes missing. Then the phone rings and a voice Tyler doesn't recognize says, if you want to see your wife again, you need to do a job for me, but it's illegal so you can't tell anyone. I'm sure that sounds cliched as hell, but now Tyler himself would have to be involved, and he'd be at a disadvantage from the first film because he wouldn't get to rely on the same team and resources, and it comes with a built-in subplot. While doing whatever the illegal job is, Tyler would have to figure out who took his wife and how to get her back. There's your premise, Joe. Next time, just come to me. Where's my $70 million? Sitting on my futon over here.
Squad, guessing up?
Yep, ETA, 2 minutes.